teacher bullied teenager in school, unaware her father is a police captain. How far will someone go to protect a secret? How blind can prejudice make a person until they don't realize the weight of their actions, or the true identity of the person they're hurting? Jasmine Daniels sat at the back of Mrs. Bentley's classroom, the one place she thought would make her invisible. But every glance from her teacher felt like a spotlight, every word spoken aimed directly at her. The room was hot and stifling, not just from the broken air conditioning, but from the tension that had been building between her and Mrs. Bentley for months. Today, Mrs. Bentley was giving a lecture on civil rights, a topic that always seemed to unleash the ugliest side of her. Jasmine watched as her teacher's eyes flickered toward her again and again, almost daring her to speak up, to challenge her version of history. Some people, Mrs. Bentley said, her voice cool and dripping with condescension, think that because they've been oppressed, they are entitled to special treatment. But in my classroom, everyone earns what they get. Jasmine's stomach churned. She wasn't naive. She knew Mrs. Bentley had been waiting for her to break, to retaliate in front of the whole class. The comments had started in her freshman year, subtle at first, offhand remarks that always seemed to cut a little too deep. You would do better if you didn't try to fit a stereotype. Mrs. Bentley had once said, after marking Jasmine's essay down for reasons that didn't make sense, I expect more from students like you, even though the odds are stacked against you. Students like me? Jasmine thought. What did that even mean? She wasn't the only black student in her school, but she was the only one Mrs. Bentley had consistently targeted. Her father, Captain Daniel Daniels, had warned her about people like this, but Jasmine had wanted to handle it herself. She didn't want to be the girl who always ran to her dad, especially since he'd recently been promoted to head of the city's police department. Jasmine swallowed her pride and ignored Mrs. Bentley's bait, but it gnawed at her. The idea that this teacher, who was supposed to uplift and educate, only sought to belittle and tear her down. And worse, she did it in front of her peers. By the time the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Jasmine's hands were trembling. Her best friend, Lauren, noticed. You okay? She whispered as they packed their bags. Yeah, Jasmine lied, forcing a tight smile. But she wasn't. Mrs. Bentley's words stayed with her long after the lesson ended. The cruel irony that a teacher would use a history of injustice to reinforce her own prejudices was too much to bear. It was like being stuck in a nightmare that wouldn't end. Later that day, during lunch, Jasmine found herself replaying the morning's events over and over. Why did Mrs. Bentley hate her so much? Why was she so intent on making Jasmine feel small, and how far was she willing to go? When Jasmine confided in Lauren, her friend's response was swift. You need to tell someone. This isn't just about a bad teacher anymore. She's attacking you, Jasmine, and it's not right. But Jasmine hesitated. What would happen if her dad got involved? He was the new police captain. Would people think she was using his position to get special treatment? Would it make things worse? That's when everything started to spiral. The next day, Mrs. Bentley decided to escalate things. During a class discussion on racism, Mrs. Bentley looked straight at Jasmine and said, well, it's easy for some people to blame the system. It's harder to admit when you're the problem. Jasmine froze. The entire class turned to look at her. A few students chuckled awkwardly, sensing the tension. Excuse me? Jasmine whispered, but Mrs. Bentley heard her. You heard me, Mrs. Bentley said, her tone sickly sweet. Maybe if you focused more on your studies and less on playing the victim, you wouldn't have so many problems. Jasmine's chest tightened. This wasn't just about her performance in class anymore. This was personal, and the entire room could feel it. Before Jasmine could respond, Mrs. Bentley continued, Why don't you give us your perspective, Jasmine? I'm sure you have plenty to say about systemic racism, don't you? The air seemed to leave the room. Jasmine could feel the weight of her classmates' stares pressing down on her. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to say something, anything to stop this. But she didn't. She stayed silent. That night, after holding it together all day, Jasmine broke down. She told her father everything, how Mrs. Bentley had been tormenting her for years, how it had all come to a head with that final, humiliating display in front of the class. Captain Daniels listened, his face hardening with every word. Why didn't you come to me sooner? he asked gently. I didn't want to make it worse, Jasmine admitted. I didn't want people to think I was using you to solve my problems. Captain Daniels' jaw tightened. This isn't about me. This is about you being treated with the respect you deserve. The next morning, Captain Daniels took action. He arranged a meeting with the school principal and the superintendent. Jasmine wasn't sure what to expect, but she was relieved that her father was finally stepping in. It wasn't just about standing up to Mrs. Bentley. It was about showing everyone that her behavior wouldn't be tolerated. When Captain Daniels walked into the school, heads turned. He wasn't just a father here. He was the head of the city's police force. As he made his way to the principal's office, he felt a burning anger rise in his chest. No one, not even someone as entitled as Mrs. Bentley, would get away with treating his daughter like this. In the meeting, the principal, Mr. Harding, tried to downplay the situation. Captain Daniels, I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. Mrs. Bentley is one of our most respected teachers. Respected by who? Captain Daniels asked, his voice cold. Certainly not by the students she humiliates. Not by my daughter. Mr. Harding's face paled, but he tried to maintain his composure. We've never had complaints about Mrs. Bentley before. Then you haven't been listening, Captain Daniels replied. Because it's not just my daughter. She's been targeting other students too. And it stops today. As the tension mounted in the room, Mrs. Bentley was called in. When she walked through the door, her confident smirk faltered for just a second as she realized who was sitting across from her. Captain Daniels, she said, her voice tight. I didn't realize you were involved. Clearly, Captain Daniels replied, his tone icy, but you should have. You should have realized that every student in this school deserves respect, regardless of who their parents are. Mrs. Bentley shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I treat all my students equally, she said defensively. Do you? Captain Daniels leaned forward. Because from what I've heard, you've gone out of your way to make my daughter feel less than. And that's not equality. That's abuse of power. The room went silent. Mrs. Bentley's face reddened, and for the first time she seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. Captain Daniels wasn't finished. You think you can bully my daughter because you think no one will stand up to you. But you're wrong. You've been wrong from the start. Mrs. Bentley opened her mouth to respond, but Captain Daniels held up a hand. This meeting isn't about arguing with you. This is about accountability. And accountability came swiftly. As more students came forward with their own stories of Mrs. Bentley's biased treatment, it became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. If you've watched this far, leave a 100 in the comments section because you are type of person that likes to finish what they started. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to get notified whenever we drop new videos. Now back to the story. The school board launched an official investigation, and Mrs. Bentley was placed on leave. But that wasn't the end of it. Captain Daniels took it a step further. He made sure the media got wind of the story, not just for Jasmine's sake, but for every student who had been mistreated by a person in power. News outlets picked up on the story, highlighting the issues of racism and bullying in the classroom. The public outcry was immediate. Parents, students, and community leaders demanded action. It wasn't just about firing one bad teacher. It was about addressing the systemic issues that allowed someone like Mrs. Bentley to thrive unchecked for so long. By the time Mrs. Bentley's case reached the state education board, her fate was sealed. Her teaching license was revoked, and she became a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when prejudice goes unchecked. It wasn't just a victory for Jasmine. It was a victory for every student who had ever been silenced. As for Jasmine, the experience changed her. She had always been strong, but this had shown her the true power of standing up for what was right. She knew that there were still battles to fight, both for herself and for others, but now she had the confidence to face them head-on. Because in the end, Jasmine learned that silence helps no one. And sometimes, the loudest statement you can make is simply refusing to back down. Now the question remains, how many other classrooms still have teachers like Mrs. Bentley? And how many students are still waiting for their chance to speak out?